and the final Sunday of early voting. It created massive congestion in some places, most notably South Florida, but also some other counties. And my colleague, Michael Herron, and I have kind of analyzed some of those early voting patterns and where the congestion is. But before we get to that, here is a chart that, again, it's going to be really difficult for you to see, but this dotted 45-degree line, any dots that are below on the bottom right is the percentage of early votes among, in this case, African Americans, whites, and Hispanics in 2008 compared to 2012. So any of those dots that fall below that 45-degree line means that that population by county voted less early in 2012 than they did in 2008. And you can see that you have large counties, the large spots are African Americans in Broward and Hillsborough, Palm Beach, Duval counties, which had much, the drop was pretty substantial in these counties. There's those large black dots. I don't know if this is going to work. Pointer. But along that line, you're going to see a considerable drop from where it was in 2008 down to 2012. So going from 35% to 25% of the absentee ballots among African Americans cast. Now, if everything was equal in terms of how ballots were counted, that wouldn't be really a problem. But the fact of the matter is that very few votes that are cast early are rejected. In fact, almost no votes that are cast early are rejected. There are very few provisional ballots cast during the early voting period of time, and those can be corrected before Election Day, as opposed to absentee ballots, where we actually have a fair number of absentee ballots that are rejected. Overall, it's over around 1% of all absentee ballots are rejected. Again, if you're talking about 8.5 million votes cast, that adds up to a lot of rejected ballots. I'll talk about that again in a second. So we saw this shift, most pronounced among African Americans in terms of less voting early. Largely it was because of congestion. The other thing to think about is that a lot of people who voted early in 2008, in the last Sunday, didn't vote at all in 2012. So what my colleague and I did was we looked at the voting patterns, we found the individuals who voted early, we isolated those who voted on Sunday, and we looked to see what they did in 2012. And what we found was, in fact, that on the bottom of these two charts are early voting in 2008 among African Americans, Hispanics, and whites, and over here among Democrats, NPAs, and Republicans. This final column of data, or data points, are African Americans and Hispanics and whites that did not cast a ballot in the 2012 election who voted in 2008. All right? So basically what you have is about 3/4 of those who cast a ballot on the final Sunday did vote, but 25% of those early voters didn't vote. Whereas if you were an early voter early on in the process, and you're African American, you had an 85% chance of voting in 2012 if you voted in that first week. So you've eliminated the first 5 days of early voting. These individuals ended up voting again in 2012. It's mostly to the end, that final day, who for one reason or another didn't cast a ballot in 2012. And the rate was much higher among, so the rate cast was much lower among Hispanics than among African Americans and whites, which was right around the same, about 78%. That's an interesting pattern for us in terms of what was going on with the folks who were coming out to the polls on that final Sunday of early voting in 2008, and what happened to them when that final Sunday was no longer available, but they were late to decide if they wanted to come to the polls. Where were the activists? Where were the different groups that are trying to bring people to the polls? Where were the parties in terms of reaching out to that demographic, which clearly are peripheral voters that are waiting until that final Sunday? No longer is that final Sunday there. A quarter of them didn't turn out to vote. Again, much higher than other times during the voting period. You see the same pattern with respect to Democrats, where about 20% of Democrats who voted on the final Sunday didn't turn out to vote in 2012. NPAs, it was about 73% turned out, so 27% didn't turn out. That's a fairly substantial number, and we would expect that NPAs that don't have the same type of social network, especially political parties, going and making sure that they're going to grab and go to the polls on another day, get out to vote, or on election day. But this is an interesting pattern for us to try to isolate. Why didn't some of these people vote on election day? Well, there was tremendous congestion at the polls, as we know. Not necessarily here in Alachua County, but elsewhere. I have 4 plots up here, which again is going to strain anyone's eyes, even mine up close here. But what we have done is we've taken the precinct wait times per county across 41 counties where we were able to get data for the public records. And we were able to look at the composition in terms of the race and ethnicity of those different precincts. And so if you look at a precinct like, look at the precincts, the 500 or so precincts in Orange County, or the 900 or so precincts in Miami-Dade, we can estimate, we know exactly the percentage of Hispanics, blacks, and whites who turned out to vote in those precincts, and we know what the wait times were in terms of when the last voter cast a ballot in these polling stations across them. And we find that in places like Orange County, that you had, the darker the dots, the longer the wait times. The longest wait times were in places that had 50% white, 50% Hispanic. In Osceola County, there were almost all Hispanic polling stations that had the longest wait times. In Miami-Dade, it was largely Hispanic, with not many wait times actually among African Americans in Miami-Dade. Those are very light shaded dots. In fact, Hillsborough, you had the longest wait times in some predominantly white areas. They happen to be college campuses, if you break it down by age. So there's some interesting patterns. We had a polling station that closed, I think, 113 minutes late here in Gainesville, in Alachua County, of the 61 polling stations in 2012. It was on campus at the Rights Union, where we had the longest lines. Again, we don't know, because no one's taking count how many people left the lines on election day. There have been some estimates. I'm not sure if I buy them in terms of looking at Orange County in the area of, and estimating out to about 200,000. But we know that it's not zero. And this is a real problem if that's your last chance of being able to vote. Some of the supervisors, I think Pam Carpenter has done a good job in terms of the early voting, making it accessible. I've got a student who's actually working right now on looking at the distance you live from the early voting sites and what is your likelihood of turning out to vote in an early voting site. We're actually finding a fairly big effect for every minute of delay in terms of traffic estimates using Google Maps leads to about a 2 percentage point less likelihood, controlling for everything else we know about you in terms of your age and race and ethnicity and party, a decrease in actually using the early voting. So our 3 stations, I think, are probably about as limited as you can be. I would like to actually see more early voting stations, certainly one on campus, maybe another one in northwest part of Alachua County. This is obviously questions of resources as well as limitations that the state has put on the supervisors in terms of where they can be. But there's clearly a relationship in terms of where people are and where they can vote further. Here's Alachua County. As I said, there's one precinct here, this one, that was actually disproportionately African American versus white, that had very long, this is not the Rights Union, this is the Rights Union. Well, again, largely white, some Hispanic, some African American. But there was a polling place over on the east side of town that had the second longest wait time. That's not there. Michael and I also looked at early voting in Miami-Dade, where they had estimated wait times for each of the 8 days of early voting, snapshots, hourly snapshots. And what we were able to find were, this is where the biggest wait times were for African Americans in Miami-Dade, was during early voting. If you look at the last reported wait time, disproportionately larger among African Americans. A couple last things about absentee ballots. This chart plots some of the major counties, including Alachua County, in terms of the absentee ballots that were rejected in 2012. Alachua County, it was over 2% of the absentee ballots cast were rejected. That is a very high percentage. And even though the overall number of absentee ballots cast is around 27,000, it adds up. The question for me is whether or not these are all equivalent in terms of who's casting the ballots. And so one of the things that Michael and I have done is look at absentee ballot rejection rates among Hispanics as well as blacks, and we find disproportionately across the counties that African Americans cast a higher percentage of absentee ballots that were rejected as did Hispanics. Any dot above this line is on the left panel are counties that had absentee ballots that were rejected, cast by African Americans, or on the right panel by Hispanics. Again, this is something where voter education is certainly a problem. It's certainly no racial bias by a supervisor if there's no signature on the back of an envelope that comes in. That is going to be rejected out of hand. But there is a problem when you are having campaigns pushing people to vote absentee because they know there are going to be long lines, either early or on election day, but not educating people in terms of what that signature entails on the back of an envelope. If you do get a person to sign a signature, it's not the signature on your bank card that you can use or on your driver's license that you can use on election day. It's the signature that you signed when you were pre-registering as a high school student, or that you registered 30 years ago when you first moved to the county, but you don't really know what's on record. That's the signature that's being matched. And we have a much higher incidence among minorities having signatures that don't match. And that, again, something that I think falls on the backs of civic action who you are. Here's an idea just to finish this up. This is the absentee ballot rejection rate taken across the whole state of, say, a middle-aged African-American Democrat. You can see in Alachua County that 3% of African-American middle-aged Democrats cast absentee ballots that were rejected by the canvassing board here. You have some other counties, like Collier County, that was 6%. I don't know what's going on in Collier County, but that's a very high rate of absentee ballots that were rejected between ages 30 and 60 that we looked at. If you break it down, African American middle-aged black females, you can see that in Alachua County it was about 3%. So black males and black females middle-aged cast about the same percentage of absentee ballots that were rejected. What's interesting, if you look at African Americans who are over the age of 60 in Alachua County, the rate actually goes down. It was only 1.7. So where is the absentee ballot among African Americans? It's among largely younger African Americans who are not as civically engaged, probably, in terms of what it means to be signing the back of an envelope and mailing it in. All right. I have lots to talk about in terms of the effort to purge voters again. We successfully stopped that, and the supervisors stood up in 2012 in August, September with lawsuits, as well as many supervisors saying the lists that were generated were completely nonsense. Supervisors are, I think, prepared to fight back with Governor Scott's effort to use the federal Homeland Security database to identify potential non-citizens, something that is not designed to do, and that will probably generate many false positives like we had in 2012. Of the 2,625 people who were targeted for purging, they purged 107. There were only about a dozen that were actually on that list. The others were through other processes where the supervisors themselves came up with people. There was no evidence of people actually voting that were on that list. And I suspect the same problems are going to happen with using a database that is not designed to try to purge people who are citizens and who are eligible to vote. So there's a lot to be vigilant about. I know many of you in the room are very happy with the results here in Florida, and that there was an effort to counteract that voter suppression. I think there was, but I think the voter suppression was still there. There were other factors that may have led to President Obama winning re-election here, but to think that those forces were overcome, I think, is misleading, and that you need to be ever vigilant in terms of the 2014 elections and onwards. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions if we have time. If not, you know. I have one.
They are not notified that their ballot was rejected until after the election. What can we do with that legal on behalf of the supervisor election? Because people are really upset to not only black people, but also the Democratic Party who rejected, and they were notified to after the election. What can you do to help to make sure that this election can't be done?
There's very little that you can do. Pam Carper was following the law. There was a lawsuit challenging that, in fact, in Palm Beach County, where a white woman who had voted successfully since 1972 voted for the first time absentee because she knew there were long lines and congestion. Someone was in the canvassing board, heard her name, called her on the cell phone. She immediately came. There was nothing she could do. They filed a lawsuit. It was thrown out in state court, and I think that was probably the right decision. The question is whether or not there will be a fix to that in this coming legislative session. I sincerely doubt it, which is, again, highly problematic in terms of the fact that you have the right to cast a provisional ballot if there's problems on election day or during early voting, but you don't have that remedy with respect to absentee ballots. So, I had a colleague, a white woman, middle-aged, who had successfully voted, and she too got that letter 2 weeks afterwards saying that the vote didn't count. And this, again, part of it is that the supervisors have different types of forms that they use and envelopes. And some, I think Pam Carpenter's is pretty good, the instructions are pretty good, but this is a first time thing for many citizens who are casting absentee ballots, and there are a lot of instructions that you have to follow. It's easy to screw up as opposed to, if you're in the poll, having someone there to walk you through it. So that one, there was some discussion in the spring about changing that, and I would have to go back and dust off what was finally passed in terms of whether or not you can come in before election day to do that, but I'm pretty sure that didn't make it through. Yeah.
Professor Smith, I've heard you before, and I found that my concentration improved. My chair got closer. And this didn't feel like a real union meeting with all the tables spread out. I'm used to being crowded together with benches. So once I was paying attention to that, I found one important thing is the signature on the absentee ballot. Can you list about 3 or 4 other conclusions similar to that of important elements that we should remember?
Well, I've actually, this fall, Pam Carpenter was very gracious to open up her office to allow me to bring 2 undergraduate students from the University of Florida in to do some coding. We actually coded 350 randomly selected absentee ballots. We knew about a third of them were accepted, a third of them were rejected, and a third of them went to the canvassing board for other fixes. And one of the things we were very curious about, we had 2 things that we were really curious about. We were curious as to whether or not signing on the scratch pad at the DMV office, when you're asked if you want to use that to register to vote, whether or not people who had the scratch signature, like we do at Publix, and have no idea what that scratch signature looks like, have a signature that looks different. The other thing we were interested in was whether or not people who had longer signatures had a greater likelihood of success than people with short signatures. And we actually did find a positive relationship. The longer your signature is, in terms of on the ballot itself, on the back of the envelope, the greater likelihood, controlling for other factors, that your signature would be accepted. I think it's largely because the supervisor's office gives the benefit of the doubt to, in this instance, gives the benefit of the doubt, and they want to see the variation in that signature that matches up with the little thing on the screen that the clerks are looking at when they are trying to figure out whether it's a match. We didn't find the relationship that we thought with respect to the scratch signature. I think it was partly because our sample was so small in terms of the scratch. What do you need to do? You need to be following the directions. Pam Carpenter's office, I think, does a very good job of giving, again, the voter the benefit of the doubt, but you've got to remember to sign the back of that envelope. You've got to remember to get the envelope into the supervisor's office before the close of election day. There were hundreds of ballots that were not counted because of state law, and accurately, because they came in on Wednesday. That's, again, the fault of maybe the Postal Service, but it's also the fault of the voter not moving it forward. I would like to see her office actually accept in-person absentee ballots, something that her office hasn't done. And I think that is a possibility where, I would like to try to develop a system in those counties to actually count the ballots that are coming in by hand as opposed to in mail, because I think there are other eyes that look at it before it moves from the voter's hand to the supervisor's hand. As soon as that chain of custody comes to the supervisor, the voters no longer can change it. But before it goes there, someone can say, oh, make sure you sign it, make sure you're using the same signature that's on, not on your driver, not necessarily on your bank card, but what's on, not or on your driver's license, but what's on the voter registration. Last question?
You mentioned that you felt Section 5 was antiquated. I can think about that, but in some ways antiquated. My car is old. I don't get rid of it and start walking. I get in the car.
I agree 100% with you. Just because this traffic light's doing a great job stopping traffic and letting traffic go through, doesn't mean we should get rid of that traffic light, even though it doesn't have all the necessary technology. The court did that, but here's the thing. The court warned Congress in 2007, after it did nothing to change the Voting Rights Act in 2006, except say, let's renew it for 25 years. They warned them in 2007, if you don't change it, if you don't use a different metric than the registration of African Americans and the turnout of African Americans in 1964, we're going to say this is antiquated. You need to come up with other metrics. There are plenty of other metrics we can use to look at racial and ethnic and language discrimination that's going on in this country. There's no, I mean, I can give you a dozen things we could look at right now. I'm giving you several right here. But what the court said in its decision in 2007 was, Congress, you got to come up with something else, because next time this comes to us, we're going to probably strike down Section 5. They didn't strike down Section 5, they ended up striking down Section 4, which is the criteria. But it effectively made Section 5, which is the 15 states under the VRA, gone. So I would agree completely that the analogy that was used in the court was completely wrong with respect to no longer needing it. Again, if a traffic stop is working, it doesn't mean get rid of it because it's been working so well for the last 40 years, right? 50 years. You've got to make some changes. So whether Congress is going to do that, I'm pretty doubtful. I would like to see this be actually an issue, because I think public opinion is actually in favor of making sure that voting rights are safe and secure, and that everyone has an equal opportunity if we actually put that to the public discourse. So.